Hello and welcome to another episode of Chats with Chip. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, and I am very pleased to have with me today Matt Johnson. Matt is the author of MicroFamous. He also has a podcast promotion agency, and he's got his own podcast. So welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks, Chip. I'm excited to be here.
It is great to have you here. And before we dive into the conversation, why don't you share a little bit more about yourself and what you do so that listeners have a base to work off of?
All right. So short story, we produce and launch podcasts mostly for the coach, consultant, kind of independent thought leader market. And the agency takes me about 45 hours a week to run. So not bad. I do what I want with my own time outside of that, which is what gave me the time to write the book. And then, the rest of it's just kind of optional marketing and lead gen activities like running the podcast and, things like that, preparing for the future books and stuff like that. But 5 years ago, I was just some dude working at another, guy's marketing agency here in San Diego. And I got the chance to step into business development. And his idea for doing biz dev was to put me on as a host of like Google Hangouts back when that was a thing. And just to kind of nurture the relationships with all their key strategic partners and influencers in the agency. And that went really well, to the point where one of them called me up one day and said, dude, we should start a podcast together. Mm-hmm. And that was about as far as that idea went. Beyond that was just to start a podcast because we thought it would be fun. And that was 5 years ago. And now that podcast is, it's called Real Estate Uncensored. It's in the kind of the residential market, and 1.5 million downloads and counting, and still going strong. Run, bunch of accolades, a bunch of top 10 lists in that space. It essentially took me from being a nobody that worked at an agency to speaking on stages in the industry and being an influencer and an insider in 18 months. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my experience.
That's fantastic. And podcasting is fun. So, mm-hmm. why not do it? I've had podcasts for many years and really enjoy it. And now
I know, you're one of the OGs.
Well, yeah. I started doing audio back in the 1990s, actually, before it was even called podcasts. And it was a heck of a lot harder to publish things back then. Mm-hmm. I used to have a little, it was like a telephone bug that I had on my phone. It was as if the FBI
to record the calls.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and use that to do my telephone interviews. It was interesting. It's a whole lot easier today, where we can just use Zoom, StreamYard, those kinds of tools. So, yeah. Great. So earlier this year, you came out with your book, MicroFamous. Mm-hmm. What inspired you to write the book?
I wanted more ideal clients. That's the bottom line. Because what I found out, as an agency owner, the thing that grows the agency is client results, referrals, and then obvious social proof, in my space. Because I'm pretty narrowly niched down. So a lot of times when my prospects would come to me, they look at my page and they look at the other people that we work with, and they go, oh, I know them, and I know them, and I know them. Right. So it was a pretty easy yes, but I wanted more of that. And I wanted them to come in with the right expectations. So I wrote a book basically that was all the things I wish ideal clients knew. And if they believed and agreed with me on these things, it would make them more ideal clients. So the first third of the book is essentially all strategy and the mindset of how do you align a podcast with the rest of your business strategy so the podcast actually generates a 10x ROI. Because I'm working with people that, look, if you don't generate me actual revenue, this is a waste of my time. I can go post on Facebook if I want to waste time. And so I wanted to basically strip away all the extraneous stuff and all the confusion, and just give my hey, this is my point of view on how do you actually run a podcast that generates a 10x return to the business, and attract the right people in. So that was the genesis of the idea.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great point, that you need to tie the podcasting or anything else that you're doing back to an actual business strategy. Mm-hmm. And frankly, this is a mistake that I've made over the years, in part because I like doing these kinds of things. You sometimes do them more out of vanity and enjoyment than you do out of real strategy. But the more that you tie it into the strategy, the better the results you'll see.
Well, yeah, and the thing that we lose sight of a lot of times, and maybe not so much in the big company world, but definitely in entrepreneur land where I run, which is that it's got to give something back to you, and sometimes that giving back is in the form of money, but also needs to give back to you in terms of energy and enjoyment. The problem is when you do something strictly for the energy and in the enjoyment, but it doesn't directly translate into revenue, even the energy you get back from the enjoyment of it starts to fade over time. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't want people coming in just for the cool factor of podcasting, and then 6 months later they were starting to get burned out on it because they weren't seeing the results. Because I knew that arc was going to happen. So I wanted them coming in for the right reasons, with the right expectations, the right time frame in mind, and having all the other stuff in place that they actually got not just enjoyment out of it, but it actually produced return, so that they kept on enjoying it and kept on being clients for 2, 3, 4 years.
And to see the maximum results, you really need that consistency and persistence over time, right? It's not something that you can have overnight success in most cases.
No, it's not. And I think any agency owner listening is probably identifying, like if you sell any kind of content marketing, like there's probably a 12 to 18 month window. I mean, even Gary Vee himself said he shouted into the void on Wine Library TV for the first 18 months. I think no single video of his got 300 views, more like over 300 views in the first 18 months. Same guy that's now running a $600 million agency couldn't get more than 300 views on his YouTube videos. And so I think anybody that sells like a content marketing strategy understands it takes that kind of time horizon. And I thank God I run in the circles where it's the same decision maker. But when you've got decision makers switching out, you better be really secure that company is getting a return.
Right. Now, you advocate podcasts as a way to get MicroFamous. But yet you wrote a book about it. So book versus podcast, do you need both? Talk to me about that a little bit.
Yes, there's a chapter in the book about that, book versus podcast. And I love this discussion because I think in a lot of cases, the podcast should come first. And I don't say that selfishly because I kind of didn't do it necessarily the right way around. I jumped into like a podcast and then we did all kinds of other stuff. But like Seth Godin basically said, like somebody asked him like, when's the best time to start a blog if I want to promote a book? He's like, well, then the best time was 2 years before you launched the book. The next best time is today. And to me, that's what like the podcasting is the new form of blogging. If you want to build and nurture an audience that then you can launch something to, it's better to have started a podcast 2 years ago. If you don't have one now, start one today so that you can start building and nurturing that audience so that when you do have a book, you have a group of people to launch it to. So thankfully I had that. With my own, and was able to launch it, and through all the relationships I'd built up with the podcast guests that I had a really, really good kind of strategic referral partner and early advocate, early readers kind of group that I was able to reach out to. So immediately launched and hit like #1 new release and #1 in a couple of different categories and got some really great reviews. And that fed into my landing page for the book. Looks really good because it's got a whole bunch of really great reviews from prominent people that people in my world will know. And it all came from doing the podcast first and then launching the book later. So that's the best recommendation that I can give based on all that I've seen in people doing that world.
So it's not too late to start a podcast. We're not oversaturated at this time.
No, I mean, and this, it's, there's like 900,000 podcasts or something. What is there? 150 million WordPress blogs. Right. To me, the sky is the limit. And one of my recent guests put it really well. He just launched like this random podcast in Canadian politics, and it took off and gets like $50,000 a month. He said, it's all about finding the crack in the market. Somewhere out there's an audience that is underserved and neglected. And if you can create a podcast for them, they'll find you. It's only a matter of time. And then that podcast has a real legit shot at taking off. And I think that's still the case today. So for any company out there, if you have an underserved market that it doesn't matter how many podcasts are in your space right now, there's always some little pocket of it that feels neglected by the shows that are out there right now. Somebody's scrolling through all the podcasts out there right now and having to scroll through 5 or 10 episodes to find one that they like. That's your person. Figure out what they're finding and go make more of that.
Mm-hmm. And the trick is to find that crack in the market that matches up with your ideal client, right? I mean, that's really, and I think that's the mistake a lot of folks make when they start the podcast. They look for the gap in the market. They look for the maximum number of eyeballs, but they lose sight of their ideal client.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. They start by looking at where the audience is, and they don't keep an eye out for who their ideal client is. Yeah, and I talked to somebody the other day who runs a podcast, and it gets 20,000 downloads a month, pretty respectable for a business podcast, and but it has no connection to his business. He did exactly what you said. He started a podcast that took off, and he has listeners, and now he's trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I get it to promote my core business, or how do I need to come up with something to sell them? And that's a really not fun place to be in, because then you feel like if you transition things, you're letting your audience down. If you try to sell something that isn't a good match for them, you're shortchanging your business because you're spending time marketing something that isn't tying into your business. Like it's a really weird position to be in, to have like an audience of people that doesn't buy the very core thing you sell. Mm-hmm. So yeah, always start with your ideal clients. Figure out where their crack in the market is. Where are they being underserved in the podcast world? And that'll lead you to the right place a lot faster.
Right. And most podcasts, at least in the B2B space, don't need 1 million downloads to be successful. They would do, I mean, frankly, a few hundred may be fine as long as it's the right few hundred.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got friends and clients who are all in this really one interesting niche in real estate, where you have like team leaders and independent brokers, and the total addressable market is 10 to 15,000 people, and all of those friends of mine run multi 6 and 7 figure businesses selling to that tiny market. And we're talking about 2 people's worth of Facebook friends is your entire target market. And they're charging, $1,000, $1,500 a month. These are not small price tags for like individual solo businesses. And they all run 7-figure businesses selling to that tiny market. And so I think we way overestimate how many people we need to be consuming our content in any form in order to actually get sales. And I think more than that, it leads us away from the very ideas that actually would generate sales. I think that quest for more listeners, more audience, just for the sake of it, leads us away from a very polarizing idea or a really sharp, clear, and compelling idea that gets people in the door and gets them off the couch and taking action, because it's just too broad. We're trying to reach too many people. So we end up saying something that isn't all that compelling to any one of them.
Now, if I'm an agency owner and I'm thinking about starting a podcast, what should I be thinking about as far as format? And obviously I need to be thinking about my ideal client, but how should I be thinking about format, frequency? What advice do you give people when they're first getting started?
So in the book, I talk about the weekly podcast formula. That's where I'd start, is interviewing 2 people a month from like a cold audience. Just build your network, interview the other influencers in the space. Do 1 episode with a successful guest or client as a guest, and then 1 episode where it's just you speaking to the audience. If you do that, you'll be fine. The question is really for the agency owner that's running a podcast, what's the goal with the podcast? And to me, there is like an agency owner can have 2 levels of expertise. You can be an expert in what you do for clients, and that's great. That's also like table stakes. Like if you're not an expert at what you do for clients, like you just get out of the game.
You're in trouble.
You're in trouble. That's what they expect. Like that's just the barrier to entry. But what I noticed from my background, like being like coming from the real estate space, like I was in real estate. I had read all the books. I knew who the coaches were. I jumped on and I hosted the podcast, and I became an expert in what my clients did, to the point where I could speak at their events, not about what I did. I could speak at their events about what they did. That's a whole different level of expertise. If I was an agency owner looking to start a podcast and expecting it to generate business, that's what my goal would be. Is I don't want to just show that I'm an expert at what I do. I want to show that I'm an expert at what you do, Mr. Client. That's what my goal would be. Is I want to learn and soak up as much as I can about the industry. I want to share my opinions on where the industry is going, and I want to show that I'm not just an expert in what I do, but I'm an expert in what my clients do, because that's a whole different level of trust. When they know that you're an expert in what they do and you really deeply understand their business, when you come to them and you say, "This is the marketing strategy I recommend for you," there is a completely different level of respect that goes along with that.
Mm-hmm. And if you plan your podcast well, you can do all of these things, right? You can reach your target audience, you can use it to build your network, and you can use it to learn by bringing on the experts that help you understand the industry that you're serving even better.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't have said it better myself.
And I think that's an often overlooked part, the ability to use it to build your own expertise. So it's not just because if you're there and you're asking questions that you're curious about, those are the kinds of things that others in your audience are probably going to want as well. And I think that too often folks are thinking about the podcast as a way to showcase their own expertise, when in fact curiosity may be a better way to lead.
Well, when you're a deep thinker, if you're a strategic thinker, your version of curiosity is going to get other deep strategic thinkers' attention.
Right.
Now, if you're a tactics first person and your version of curiosity is to skim along the surface and ask them just kind of what they're doing that's working right now, then that's not going to get you a lot of respect. So it depends on the circumstances, but yes, if you're a deep thinker and you really pay attention to what's going on in your industry, and your curiosity leads you to really deep, interesting questions, and the audience is going, like, you may not have the answers, but man, that guy's really smart because he's asking questions that even the question himself, I wouldn't have thought to ask that. Mm-hmm. And that's when I noticed when I was doing my very first rounds, like when I was just doing Google Hangouts, is that I would sometimes throw the guest off with my question, because they'd be like, I've never thought about that before. That's a really interesting way to ask that question. It was because I was doing all that deep thinking behind the scenes, just like trying to soak up as much as I could about the industry and learn myself. So then, I would come with curiosity questions, but they were deeper questions than just the most people would ask them. And so that got their attention and it got the audience's attention. Mm-hmm. So then they would come back to those shows and they would know this is a place for really interesting and different perspective that not everybody else shares, because he's asking really different questions. To me, that's why Tim Ferriss's podcast took off. It isn't just that he's talking to all these high performers. You can get that on any random podcast now. It's the fact it's Tim Ferriss's questions. Mm-hmm. That's why you show up, because Tim Ferriss asks different questions. They're deeper, different, perspective questions. So like if you're going to do interviews, like that's what you want to do. You want to be that guy. You want to be Tim Ferriss.
Mm-hmm. And work just 4 hours a week too. At the same time, right? Oh, ironically, he doesn't work just 4 hours a week, but
he could.
He could. Yes, right. We'll save that debate for another day. Exactly. So, where do you see podcasts headed? Are obviously, particularly during these times, as everybody likes to say, there's been an explosion of video. Everybody's doing it. There's more live streams. Do you see video overtaking podcasts? Do you see them complementing each other? Do you see, what's happening with podcasts, do you think, over the next couple of years?
Well, I think complementing is a great way to put it, because I think it's always headed in this direction, and I think we're just seeing an acceleration of trends that were there, which is that companies, individual thought leaders inside companies, or people like me, that I am the thought leader for my agency, we're going to end up having a show, quote unquote, like you have a show, Chats with Chip, and that show can be consumed on video. So you can get it on YouTube and various other places, or you can go and you consume it on audio. But really, it's the entity is it's a show, and then there's just different ways to subscribe and syndicate and distribute the content. So to me, that's kind of where it's heading. I've already split my podcast into two, so I'm experimenting with kind of like a dual podcast strategy where there are two different feeds, one for all of my guest episodes, one for all my solo strategy episodes. So each feed is a little bit more focused, and if people stumble onto any one of them, it's a little bit more crystal clear what they're going to get out of the show. So I think we're going to see more of that. Drift, the SaaS company that does like chatbots and things like that. I was talking to somebody that referred me over to them and told me like, just, hey, look, these guys are doing podcasting like at a company level really well. And if you go look at the podcast page on their website, they've got 5 different shows hosted by 5 different people inside their organization on each different level of their service, appealing to a different buyer persona. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I see things going is, converging towards the main thought leader having a show, and then potentially having multiple different sub shows or sub podcasts within your overall content strategy that hits different buyer personas with different types of content.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've focused a lot of our discussion so far on interview-style podcasts, but we've touched on the solo shows, and you just mentioned that you have the 2 different feeds. What's your advice to someone who says, look, I don't want to deal with all of the hassles of scheduling guests and all that, because that takes time. Mm-hmm. So maybe I just want to go the solo route. What advice do you have for someone who wants to be doing solo podcasts?
I think for some people, it's exactly the right thing. I would call that a teaching podcast. And if your goal is to build authority and make a reputation for yourself, I think that's exactly what you should do. I started by mixing a solo podcast episodes into my overall show because I wanted the value of the networking along with it. And so you can absolutely do that. But yeah, if you don't want to bother with the guest booking, don't do it. Just really focus on making really great shareable content that shows your authority and credibility in the space. And yeah, it's a heck of a lot easier to run that. I would say for our clients, like if you're a busy thought leader, it is a lot easier to jump on and have a conversation with somebody else to record content, if that makes sense. And if you get the right guests, the hassle of scheduling them is more than offset by the enjoyment you have of having the conversation. Conversations like these are fun if we're talking about stuff that we're both excited about. And it does allow you to create content faster, quicker, and easier with a lot less mental load. So that's why I typically will tell people do a blend of it instead of trying to do a solo episode podcast by yourself. Because if you're a perfectionist, you're going to get into scripting out your episodes word for word. You're going to go way down the rabbit hole, and you might find you just never run your podcast. That's the one caveat to that.
Right. Well, and that begs the question, do you need to be a perfectionist? Or people, what are people's expectations when they're listening to podcasts in the B2B space these days?
No, I think perfectionism gets in the way a lot more than it helps. I think what you shoot for is consistent excellence, but not perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I are running different gear. Your gear is probably more expensive than mine, but mine is good enough for my purpose. A good solid webcam, right? But I'm not running a DSLR camera.
Mm-hmm.
The microphone I'm recording into is under $100 on Amazon, and I have this microphone for a very specific reason, which is that it doesn't pick up all this other stuff. So I don't need to be in an NPR studio to sound good. I can take this microphone to a hotel room, or even out to my car if I need to, and I can record an episode and it sounds identically the same.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a podcast episode or, like a microphone that could conceivably sound better in specific situations? Absolutely. But not for my life as a coach, consultant, thought leader, agency owner, right? So that's why buying the most expensive gear and being a perfectionist on certain things ends up shooting you in the foot potentially.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you used the phrase "good enough," because it is an important bar that people should be shooting for, because it needs to be good enough that it's listenable, right? You don't want something that's just, oh my God, I've got to crank my volume up all the way, and even then I'm still straining to hear. There's so much background noise, it's distracting. But it doesn't have to be NPR quality or broadcast quality.
Not at all. No, especially in the podcast world, it's really more about a base level of audio quality, and then what's your content. If your content speaks to me and your audio isn't annoying, then I'm going to listen.
Mm-hmm. Now, in all of the work that you're doing for clients and helping them put together their podcasts, are there trends that you're seeing in there in the data that you're looking at? Are there certain types of shows that work better? Not necessarily for industries, but are there formats that are working better? At length, are 20-minute podcasts better than 40-minute or 60-minute, or is it really irrelevant?
Yeah, I am seeing and I'm sure you're probably seeing this too, just an overall downtrend in people's attention spans. And my personal belief on it is that a lot of people in a lot of spaces now, if they've been paying attention to podcasts at all, they kind of have their favorites. So now the new podcasts that are coming out, you're essentially competing for existing podcast listeners, and you're trying to get them to shift some of their minutes away from listening to the Joe Rogans and the Entrepreneurs on Fire over to yours. Okay. So it's like, great. Well, it's a lot less of a commitment for them to listen to your 20-minute episode than your 3-hour episode. And I know people that want to do like a Joe Rogan style podcast in their industry niche, and I have to walk the expectations back, because it's a lot easier to get somebody to take a chance on you and a new podcast if you're not asking as much from them, and you don't take a half hour to warm up to get to the good parts.
Right.
So I just think, shorter attention spans. So over on the MicroFamous podcast, which is my solo strategy show, I try to keep all my solo episodes to around 15 minutes. So I typically don't cover any more than 3 bullet points in a strategy episode. It's about what I think most people can handle and what I can get across clearly in 15 minutes. And then it's on to the next episode. So I'm not asking too much of them to listen to my dulcet tones for longer than 15 minutes. So shorter attention spans, I think that's the biggest thing I'm seeing.
Yeah, and my approach has generally been to try to keep podcasts under 30 minutes, because that aligned with commutes pre-pandemic, and aligns with the amount of time someone will spend on the treadmill or the exercise bike or something like that too.
I put out that question though to my email list the other day, and I got one person that said, "Well, I really like when they're about an hour and a half long, an hour and 45, because that's how my evening walk is." I'm like, well, you are in the minority, buddy. I don't know who else is walking an hour and 45 minutes.
I was going to say that's a long time to walk, and that's a long time to listen to a single podcast. But
right.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about the content itself and the format, and that. But what about? I mean, you can't just create the podcast and expect that people will show up. So what about the promotion side of the podcast? What advice do you have for folks if they're getting started and they're trying to build an audience?
So the biggest thing that I run up against I would say that is a misconception is that the shiny objects do it, right? The audiograms where you see the little waveform, or the video clips, the Gary Vee style video clips and stuff like that. And those things all help. They can't hurt. A little bit of visibility never hurt anyone. But 60% of all podcast growth comes from word of mouth. Like, that's the dirty little secret in podcast growth. So the question is, are you creating a show that your ideal clients will love and tell their friends about? Because if not, everything else is that much harder. But then if you do create a podcast that your ideal clients will love, well, then it's just a matter of getting that message to them so it becomes a different challenge. And the first place I tell people is go get featured, right? So there's a whole ecosystem of podcasts in your space, most likely. There's other places where your ideal client's attention is. Go there, pitch yourself as a guest so that you can speak to your ideal clients and they find out you host a podcast and they'll come check it out. So if you're not doing that, like if I have clients that they want to grow their show faster, and they're not getting featured, my first question is, who on your team could be pitching you right now? Because I've got the training for them. Just give me somebody, an intern, a VA, I don't care who it is. Just give me somebody that I can give them the training so that you can have 5 to 10 pitch emails going out every couple of weeks to get you featured on podcasts. Because if you're not doing that, all the other things like the audiograms and, throwing out another post on Instagram that reaches 10 people, it's just not going to move the needle.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing about podcasts that a lot of folks overlook, they think about it in terms of lead generation and marketing and thought leadership and that sort of thing, but it actually can help with the sales process itself, right?
Oh, yeah.
Particularly for anyone selling expertise, and obviously agencies are selling expertise, someone who has listened to your podcast, they feel like they know you more. And so, at least in my experience, it dramatically shortens the sales cycle when you're talking to someone who has seen or heard you speak before.
Yeah, and I couldn't have said it any better than that phrase. It shortens the sales cycle, so I won't elaborate on that part. But there is a funny story just to piggyback off of that. I was speaking at an event a couple of years ago that was in kind of that same niche where I spend a good chunk of my time. And I was in between sessions hanging out with a client who was also speaking at that event. And somebody came up to me. And there's always been an inside joke on my real estate podcast about how I have like a fake wife and 3 overweight kids. Like we would role play through sales scenarios, and my co-host assigned me a wife and kids. So this random person came up and said, "Hey Matt, how's Julie? How's the wife and kids?" And it's amazing how much, like, when people listen to a podcast over time, they get the inside jokes. Right, they understand and they listen. They get to know you. They know a little bit about your life. They know that like that's not a real wife and kids and all that fun stuff. And that doesn't happen very often in the business world. Like, you don't get that kind of relationship if I ran 20,000 Facebook ads in front of them. You can only get for that from spending quality time with somebody with your voice in their ear. And so to me that's that's a combination of the most effective part and the most fun part is building the relationships with the people who listen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember I was at an event I think it was in Boston about 10 years ago, and I was having a conversation with somebody who was a marketing event, and I heard someone behind me say, "Hey, I know that voice." And so it was someone I had never met before, but they recognized my voice from my podcast, and so they came over to say hello. So you really can, particularly when you're focused on a niche audience, which is what most B2B podcasts would be doing, you're able to have that kind of an impact much more easily. Than if you're, pursuing mentions in the Wall Street Journal or something like that, which are great for vanity, but don't tend to do all that much for the bottom line.
No, they don't. They are great for vanity and for credibility. But yeah, as far as building relationships with people, there's no place like podcasting where you get to spend 20, 30, 40 minutes with somebody. There's just no other form of marketing where people are actually looking for solutions and spending that amount of time. I mean, maybe they'll spend 5 minutes reading your white paper, but not much, not beyond that. Somebody told me the other day that the average length of a business book that people actually read is to page 18, which immediately wanted to make me throw my book across the room in frustration. But I get it. We're all busy. But that's why we have podcasting.
Yeah, and that's actually probably a good place to end it, because most business books are really magazine articles run amok. So I guess if you get to page 18, that's about the length of a good long, business magazine article, right?
Oh, that's hilarious! A business article run amok. I'm going to steal that. That's awesome.
But in any case, if someone is interested in learning more, they'd like to get the book, they'd like to listen to the podcast, where should they go?
Easiest place is getmicrofamous.com, because the links out to everything is there. If you are a reader, first of all, I love you. Thank you for keeping the written word alive. But if you want to get a physical copy of the book, we do the whole free plus shipping thing. You know how the drill goes. So just go to microfamousbook.com and you can get that there.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, Matt. It's been a great conversation. I think you've given lots of really practical advice for agency owners. So
thanks, Chip. I appreciate it.
Great. My guest today has been Matt Johnson, the author of MicroFamous.